Hi everyone, I'm Elise Padilla, the director of NAMI's STAR Center. Thank you for joining us as we explore peer support programs and talk to some awe-inspiring and empowering peer leaders in our communities who are going to share their stories of recovery, work in the community, and self-care tips. If you're new to the STAR Center, please check us out at peerstar.org where you can learn more about us. What we want to do here is to support you to connect with the power of your own story, embrace leadership opportunities, and build communities where every person and family coping with mental health and substance use challenges has hope for a meaningful life. I look forward to sharing my story, the stories of others, and learning from each and every one of you through the Star Center podcast titled Hear Me Now. On Hear Me Now, we're going to be talking with Maxine Henry, and we're going to be discussing the topic of a culture of silence. Understanding what a culture of silence is, how it impacts communities that we work with, and how we can change that culture of silence by speaking out using the peer voice. Our guest today, Maxine Henry, was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was raised by her maternal grandparents since she was 2 months old and is proud to say that she grew up in a strong Chicano household where she heard Spanish being spoken every day, was surrounded by a large family, and learned the value of hard work. She also grew up witnessing her biological parents, both sets of grandparents, and other close family members live with mental health and substance use issues that typically went unaddressed. Over time, Maxine dealt with her debilitating anxiety and depression in unhealthy ways, and thus struggled for many years with what she thought were effective coping mechanisms. In her early adulthood, she decided there had to be a better way and really didn't want her children to live a life without their mother being present because she was too ill to care for them. As the second person in her family to graduate high school and the first to attend and complete an undergraduate degree, she decided to put her lived and vicarious experiences and skills in business management to assist others living with co-occurring mental health and substance use as the co-director for a peer-run, nonprofit organization, the Albuquerque Center for Hope and Recovery. As a peer, she eventually returned to school to earn a dual master's degree, an MSW with a concentration in government nonprofit leadership, and an MBA with a concentration in human resources. Maxine values the resiliency and power she's gained through her struggles just as equally as she appreciates the unwavering support provided by her husband, children, family, and close friends. Her biggest strength as a peer is her passion for investing in others so that they can overcome barriers, they can grow in their capacity to make change in their lives and in the lives of their fellow community members, and to grow leaders who are willing to be change agents. For the past 3 years, Maxine and her husband have been raising their 2 sons in the Denver metro area. Maxine, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm really excited to get to have the opportunity to share some information with you, to hear your perspective on some of the things we're going to talk about, but also just to be able to share this space to learn about the impact of peer support and the peer movement in your life, in your lived experience, and how you're able to move that towards helping others and impacting your community. So can you explain to me a little bit about your current role in the community and the work that you do in peer support?
Sure. And, I'd also like to say thank you to you for the work that you do and for allowing this space for peers such as myself to have something to say. So thank you. Let's see. So I kind of am one of those people who likes to stay busy, but I recently learned that it might not be such a good idea to use the word busy. So I like to be productive in the community. As a peer, I work with communities all over the U.S. to not only highlight the power and resiliency of peers, but also help build capacity so that there is a deeper cultural competence to the work that we do and to service delivery models in the behavioral health field.
Can you give us, to your comfort level, a little bit about your lived experience? Like, how did you find peer support? I know I stumbled onto it by accident, and it literally changed my life and the way that I was mishandling my mental health. And the people that I would go to for support were not the best places to go to. Peer support for me became a pivotal moment in my life experience, in my career, and my mental health. And I completely credit the peers that I met along the way with helping me find this path and with being able to do the work that I do now. So how did it impact you? We talked a little bit in your introduction about, this all started for you from birth. But where did the peer journey really begin?
I agree with you. My experience, though I came into my own experience in my own way, I too kind of stumbled upon peer support. And you were actually a part of that entry into peer support. But, from the time that I was born to two really young people who really had no business thinking about having babies. And truth be told, they maybe never even thought about it. But here I am. And and so from a very young age, I knew that something was different about my life. I was raised by my maternal grandparents in the most loving home in the whole wide world. I wouldn't change my childhood for anything in the world. But from the time I was 2 months old, I was raised by them. And I remember that it was a little weird that I didn't know my biological father because I'd never met him yet. I spent a lot of time with his parents, like on weekends and holidays. And I knew my biological mother because she lived up the street and was raising my two little brothers, but I didn't live with her. The beautiful thing is that my grandparents who raised me didn't even bat an eye when my mother very honestly was like, I can't take care of my daughter. And they took me in. They raised me more as their youngest child, more than their first grandchild. But I can also say that in as much as they did everything to protect me, there were probably quite a few times in my life where they overcompensated. And I think that that was kind of the beginning of my issues with codependency that later really ballooned into anxiety and depression and this like intense fear of abandonment, and so I also knew really young that something was different about the fact that my grandfather who raised me would wake up every morning at 4 a.m. to go to work, and he put food on the table every day, that we couldn't go anywhere after dark because he would come home and drink. From the moment he got home and I got to open up his lunchbox and take whatever Little Debbie snacks he actually left behind and take his work boots off until we went to bed, he drank. He drank his dinner. And I didn't realize until I was older that that's how he was coping with some of the things that he grew up with. And the interesting thing is that when I went to my paternal grandparents, very similar situation. There was quite a bit of drinking going on. I also knew from a really young age that my biological mother was using drugs. And I knew that my biological father was addicted to heroin, probably from the time that I was born. I also very clearly remember spending the weekends visiting my maternal aunt in prison and having to follow the dress code. And I remember from a really young age just kind of sitting at a cold metal table eating my lunch out of a vending machine because we were there to visit my aunt who had struggled with substance use, and it landed her in prison. And so I watched very carefully. I tend to be a really observant person. You know me very well, Elise. It takes me a while to warm up to somebody because I sit back and I observe for a really long time. And while I think sometimes it's a really good thing, I think in some ways I absorbed a lot of what I saw when I was younger. And so by the time I was in middle school and high school, and then, really young, kind of out on my own in my own apartment, I thought that I was dealing with these underlying but rapidly progressing mental health issues in the best way that I knew how. And that was drinking, that was seeking really risky behaviors, that was using pain medication whenever I could to kind of dull what was happening in my heart and in my spirit, and thinking that I was probably being a really good friend by finding friends who participated in the same kind of behavior, because then I was kind of insulated because we were all doing the same thing. And I labeled it as being very normal for a young teenager, young adult. The truth is that it was probably a miracle. It's probably a miracle that I'm not in prison, that I've never been to prison, and that I'm alive right now. So, as I got a little bit older and I ended up being who was the man who is now my husband, and we had our first child at 23, kind of hit me like a ton of bricks that my child really is going to run the risk of growing up the way I did. And again, even though I wouldn't change it for the world, I also by that time knew how not okay a lot of my childhood was. And so I just slowly started to look at what other options there were. And serendipitously, I ended up getting laid off from a job, and I thought it was kind of the end of the world at that point. And by that time, I'd already had 2 children, and I went to lunch with you, and it was kind of like, we need to do something different, and we need to let other people know that we have power and that we can actually do something good in this community. And I haven't used alcohol or pain medication for years to cope with some of these issues with anxiety and depression and abandonment. And that's how I fell into peer support. So it kind of took a long journey, but ended up there graciously eventually.
And it all happened over lunch.
It all happened over lunch.
Well, and that's incredible. Our stories are similar in paths of having seen our families going through this struggle, going and dealing with trauma that they've had for generations in maladaptive ways of using substances to alleviate pains, and by avoiding certain discussions and sharing information because we felt it brought shame and it brought unnecessary attention to kind of the chinks in our armor, right? And so this topic was the perfect opportunity to get to talk with you because I know where our stories come from and I know how generational trauma has impacted our lives. And talking about that, the definition that has come from it is the culture of silence. And it's something that we see happening in minority populations. And it really brings to light the importance of cultural competence in understanding that there are cultures that we interact with every day that really adopt this culture of silence in how they handle mental health and substance use issues. So specifically speaking towards mental health, can you explain to us a little bit about the culture of silence?
Oh, absolutely. I very much learned how to be silent when I was really, really young. And in some ways that was great, right? Because I was taught to listen. I was taught that, God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. But there are often times that I was silenced for a couple of different reasons. I was silenced because I was the youngest person in the room. I was silenced because I was the female in the room, or I was just silenced because there was this hierarchy that I really understood without even knowing that I understood from the time that I was really young. But I remember watching, for instance, my mother, seeing as though we lived up the street. I lived up the street from her. I remember her coming over crying in tears because her recent boyfriend had to beat her up one more time. And she would silently just kind of bring my brothers over to spend a safe weekend with us and go right back to the person that she was living with that was abusing her, that was abusing my brothers, both physically and emotionally and financially. And we didn't talk about it. Like, I knew my mother was getting beat up. I knew my mother was using drugs to deal with what she was dealing with at home. But nobody ever talked to me and said, this isn't a healthy relationship. This isn't something that you want to look for in a partner. It was just, we'll take the kids, we won't talk about it. Monday morning, we'll drop them off at school, and nobody needs to know. Mm-hmm. So, we didn't even call the cops, right? Mm-hmm. So it was kind of one of those, like, this is life. This happens and deal with it. Not necessarily in a healthy way, but you deal with it. And so I think that the way that I carried the torch with the circle of silence are things like I would have a lot of sadness. I'd feel a lot of weight. And I don't know why, but I think young people, especially little kids, tend to do this. I honestly believed that I did something by being born that would make my biological parents not want me, especially knowing that both of my biological parents had children within a year after I was born, and they somehow were able to raise them. And so when I would feel really sad about it or uncomfortable around my friends who lived with their parents or had a dad to bring to a daddy-daughter dance, instead I just kind of internalized it, and I wouldn't speak out about it. And as I got older, it became really, really hard for me to talk about my depression. It became really hard for me to talk about my anxiety, about my fears of abandonment, so that if I was dating somebody and he was threatening to leave, I would freak out about it and I would do whatever it would take to get that person in my life. And it wasn't until, honestly, even recently, even though I feel like I've been a peer in recovery, for at least the last 8 years, I still find it very difficult when I'm about to have an anxiety attack to call somebody that I know, because I don't want to sound like I'm blowing something out of proportion. And so sometimes I still struggle with it. Like, do I say something? Do I not say something? How am I going to look? Is it going to bring shame upon me? Is it going to bring shame upon my family? Is my husband going to want to leave me because he thinks that I finally lost my mind? And so I think it's this vicious cycle that unfortunately puts us in the way of danger sometimes. I think sometimes we protect the wrong things by being silent. And I think sometimes we enable really risky and bad behavior by silence.
Like I said, I can completely mirror that experience in saying that my parents were some of the last people that knew about my mental health struggles. They thought everything was good. They saw the exterior. They saw me succeeding in all the ways that they wanted me to, through education, through work, but they didn't know what was going on deep down inside because we were never taught to speak about it. We didn't have that opportunity to share these issues that were coming up, especially in adolescence, when things first start coming on. And so for me, I can definitely agree that that culture of silence was basically us, not even intentionally staying quiet, but us not knowing that we had the opportunity to speak out or to engage others to help us through this process. And it's really important to know that without breaking this culture of silence, we're going to keep replicating the hurts of the past. And so based on your professional experience in the work that you do with peers in the community who are walking their path of recovery, as well as with minority populations, what is the impact that this culture of silence has on us as a group, as people?
It has the potential and has proven to have the potential to have some very wide, broad, deep negative consequences. I'll give you two really close examples. I feel that culturally, growing up Latina, Chicana, around basically all Latinos in New Mexico, one of the ways that I saw this happening is with my brothers, my uncles, and my grandfather who raised me. This silence around the fact that they had to be providers and they had to be strong and they couldn't cry and they couldn't show any emotion that would make them seem weak. And I think that that's really the opposite of what a beautiful thing like that being macho could be. Like being macho could mean being strong. It could mean being a provider. And it could also mean that you're a human being and that you have emotions and that things like sorrow and sadness are just a normal part of life, right? So, I was very, very close to my grandfather who raised me. And I didn't realize until I lost him that he grew up in like such a silent world. I didn't know about all of the trauma that he experienced as a young person until he passed away 12 years ago. And he passed away because he had an unexpected heart attack that we found out later he had been suffering from for 3 days. But he went to work 9-10 hours a day for 3 days straight thinking that he had heartburn, because it was never like, go to the doctor if you're not feeling good. It was never, is there like a deeper issue as to why you're drinking every single day? Do you have something to say? Is there something on your heart that's weighing you down? And so he couldn't even get the medical care that he needed, much less the behavioral health care that could have probably extended his life and made it a higher quality. And then the exact same story repeated itself, a few years later when my brother, who is 2 years younger than me, had 2 heart attacks within 3 weeks at the age of 30 and had been dealing for a very long time silently using pain medication and cocaine to deal with the trauma that he went through living with my mother and her unaddressed trauma and ineffective coping mechanisms, and lost him to a drug overdose, and so it's that exact same cycle of silence. He did not know how to reach out and to say, I'm hurting. I have a lot of grief in my heart. I've seen things that like young people should never see. And I don't know how to get these images out of my head. I don't know how to feel proud of myself. I don't know how to move past the pain. So I'm just going to deal with the pain. And then there's nothing you can do about it because we lose them. So I think that me raising 2 young men who are both young men of color, I do my very best to Even if it's the little things every day after school. How are you doing? What happened at school today? What are you and your friends talking about these days? Just kind of listening with the two ears that God gave me and keeping the one
Mm-hmm.
mouth that God gave me shut. Listening to them say, you know what, things are going really well with my friends, or things aren't going well with my friends, or this is how I feel around this teacher, or this is the way you made me feel last night at dinner, or whatever that looks like, and giving them the space that they need to be angry sometimes, to be hurt sometimes, to cry.
Mm-hmm.
I think just giving them that space and not shutting them up is a way that we can just break the silence. It doesn't necessarily mean that bad behavior, whatever that looks like, is tolerated. We still talk about things like respect and honoring, your family and hard work and being honest and truthful, but at the same time, honoring the truth that life is not always going to be perfect. And so not setting them up for this incredible failure the first time that they get their heart broken,
Yep.
or the first time that they get in a fight with their best friend, or the first time that they don't get an A plus on a test, right? And so I think we can help end the cycle, especially in communities of color, by just giving people the space to talk about their feelings.
And I think that's a really important piece to bring in about the efficacy of peer support, because that's what sold me on it. It wasn't the definition of peer support that made me say, ooh, I want to go out and get me some of that. It wasn't the face of someone who was smiling broadly that healed my soul exactly, but it was that understanding that there was a very safe place that I could go to, and I could eventually get to the point with these individuals who had similar stories in being vulnerable. I could eventually get there in my own time, in my own space. It wasn't like in some of the other ways that I had tried to work through things where I had an hour a week and the pressure was on to talk about everything that you needed to right now. But it was just people coming to me and saying, I'm not trying to fix you. I don't have all the answers. But what I am going to do is just sit here in the silence with you. And eventually you will find your voice and the opportunity to speak up about whatever it is that you need to speak up about. And so the power of peers in breaking down this culture of silence can be phenomenal. How do you see that working in the work that you do with people and in the research you do and in the different areas that you get to touch?
So I think that you just, you brought up so many valid points there. You're right. Peer support isn't this like pretty little package with a bow on it that you go pick up at your local, store. Each one of us as peers really brings our own experience, and we can find similar threads, but the truth is that our paths look very different from each other's. And so with peer support, I feel like we have found a way to meet people where they are at, to humble ourselves and say that while this path of recovery has worked for me, I'll share it with you without glamorizing, right? But I'm going to give you enough space on your own path that if you need me to carry you sometimes, I'll do that. If you need me to just hold your hand sometimes, I'll do that. And if you need me to just kind of sit under the shade of a tree sometimes, I can do that too. And I think that that's what's so beautiful about peer support, is that it's less about how we're going through something or how we've come through something, and more about how we can understand that people need their own space to go through it on their own. Because we can't protect them from things happening. We can give them a glimmer of hope. And we can say and show and prove that through hard work, through faith, through support, we can actually overcome this. And we can be so much stronger for it. I always think about, I read somewhere, and I don't even know where I read it and how true it actually is, but I love to believe that it's absolutely true. That there was some type of like biological world that was built under this dome, and the idea was that it was almost like an inside environment that like replicated what happens in the natural world. And they grew trees and flowers and like all of this beautiful stuff, right? Almost like an indoor forest. And then when they took the dome off, all of the trees fell over and died. They realized that the trees were never ever going to survive because they didn't have what trees naturally have, which is this resiliency because they've built resistance to the wind. And that's what I think of as peer support. That, when you plant a brand new little baby tree, how you see those two little poles on the side of it with the rope in between them, so that the tree won't fall down the first time there's a gust of wind, that there are these two poles and this rope that are helping to kind of keep them a little steady, that it's really up to the tree to build its own roots and to resist the wind long enough so that those poles can be taken away and it grows into this like glorious tree. That's what I think of as peer support. I have become resistant to my own type of wind, and I could just be that pole and rope for somebody else when they need it. But I'm not going to be able to ever completely protect them from life or barriers, because then they're never going to learn how to do it on their own, and they're not going to succeed. So peer support isn't about enabling. It's not about silencing. And it's not about glamorizing. Instead, it's literally there as a support system. And ideally, we are going to train ourselves out of a job one day.
Wouldn't that be great? That's the ideal.
Yes, if I could retire because peer support is no longer needed because all of us are healthy.
Right.
And have access to the care that's appropriate for us as individuals, then that's great. But until that happens,
Well, when that happens, then we get to run away together and open our bookstore and never share books with anybody else.
Oh, no. We're not actually going to sell the books at our bookstore.
No. They're mine. How dare you? Well, and that's a beautiful analogy to make, and to realize that sometimes one pole is enough to keep us from blowing over, but there are plenty of times where we need poles for every direction that the wind could come. And the poles may not see each other and know that somebody is holding us from the east winds, but they do see our strength develop and grow. Not always the different supports we have, but the tree knows, right? We always know who's there around each corner to support us and provide us on each little leg of our recovery journey, because that's what it is. And I hear many advocates say it, that it's not a journey to recovery, but what we're doing is a journey of recovery. I don't have an endpoint, because that changes with every day that I grow and I get healthier and I find people that come along my path and open my eyes to things. But it's an unending journey that I appreciate the people who step on in different paths and realize when it's their time to step away because our paths are no longer together. But that's the beauty of the peer support and the work that we do and the communities that we've developed around us, because by modeling that we are walking on a path that has lots of rocks and lots of turns and lots of things are going to trip us up, that we know with confidence in peer support that somebody is going to come and their path is going to meet ours just when we need it. And so by breaking down this culture of silence, we're able to then say, you know what, I need help. This is a really dark, scary path in the forest and I don't know where I'm going. I'm getting turned around. I now feel comfortable and I have let go of that shame, and I can say, somebody please, I'm lost and I don't know where to go. Can somebody please come walk with me until I find my way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are so many times when somebody calls me and, they need peer support and they don't need me to give them advice. They just need to vent. And there are times when people truly are seeking advice, but as you said earlier, they actually give themselves advice as they talk it through. And then they're just kind of like, oh, thanks for the advice. I'm like, I know that I didn't give them any. And I'm like, oh, you're welcome. And you're right. The word recovery, I've never heard somebody say, I'm a peer who has recovered. Never once heard that. And I would never think to say that, because recovery is this like word that in and of itself is like almost like an action. It's in motion. You're recovering pretty
Right.
And so, one of the things that when I work with folks who, report a relapse, and a relapse looks very different for everybody. A relapse might be one instance. It might be the one time you use. It might be a few days of use. It might be, like I said, it's very different. It's like a fingerprint. I try not to ever focus on the actual relapse, which is what we're taught to do. We're taught to kind of beat ourselves up that you've come this far and now, this is how you messed it up. Instead, I try to remind folks that it's really what you do after a relapse that makes the difference. You could relapse and then reach out for help, and be vulnerable and break that circle of silence, that's when we have the potential to grow. That's when we have the potential to do something amazing, because we're learning that being vulnerable doesn't mean that you're weak. It's not being silent doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that you're a human being, and we stumbled and we get back up and we move forward.
Very true. We keep walking that path with whoever comes along, and you're on my path. I have made sure that I have fenced you into my path. So I just have to find ways to keep you walking alongside me. I have to keep you intrigued with the things that I do, the ideas I come up with, so that you're always there.
Yep. Well, I am very happy to be fenced in on your path. And I think that our paths, sometimes you and me look more like a Venn diagram than an path. We, I think, fence each other in very lovingly. But I think that the fact that you and I have been able to be friends and colleagues and hermanas, while on our paths to recovery, kind of shows it's a perfect example of what peers in recovery are capable of, right? Because you always provide me the space to be your friend or to call about something professional, and then to end the conversation with, a cynical joke, so then I feel better about what I'm going through. And then the next conversation might be, me supporting you, but that's what it's about.
Very true. So in lending so much support to other people that you do in your work, in your life, outside of work, and everything that you do, how do you protect yourself through self-care? What are some of the tried and true methods that help you not get bogged down by some of the things that you deal with on the day-to-day?
So number one thing that I do is I pray. I find that no matter where I am, who I'm in front of, what I'm doing, prayer tends to center me. And what my prayer life, what my faith has taught me is that I can't control everything. And as much as there are days when I think that I can, more often than not, I'm actually glad and relieved that I can't control everything, because then that's a ton of responsibility that no one person should have. So I do quite a bit of prayer. I reach out. I've been doing a lot better at reaching out. I also have had to learn that what works for me in self-care might not work for anybody else. So in the silence that I have learned very well, I'm such a good student of silence. I have to tell you that I'm like a black belt in isolation. Really, really good at isolating. And it's not always a really good skill to have. I mean, it's great since I work from home because I'm very organized and I can prioritize. I mean, I make the most beautiful to-do lists and I actually complete them. But I have learned that for a while, I thought that isolation was a good thing because it meant that I was no longer codependent. So what I've done lately, I would say the last year, is I've been a lot better at least once a week. I work from a public place, whether that's a library or a cafe or a restaurant. And I do that so that I can have interaction with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I can get a little bit of vitamin D because I actually get outside. And I'm not stuck within the four walls of my office, and also not stuck within the walls of my own head, because it's not always a very safe place for me to be. And so, reaching out, I also make it a point that at least once a week, I reach out to a friend to see how they're doing. Because while I do it to touch base and to be there so that they know that I support them, it also helps me because I'm not isolating. So that's what I do. I try not to isolate as much. And that works for me. Other people, they go shopping, they get massages, they do yoga, they work out, which I hate doing. It's about not drifting off onto my own island.
It's a nice island. I've been there. But yeah, it's great to realize that while we thought that was one of our protective factors, it actually is something that inhibits us from growing. And by reaching out is great. And I think it's really important to know that social inclusion within our communities, within our friends, is probably one of the most important pieces of my self-care also. And I always value our once a week check-ins that turn into 3.5 hours, and we both have kids laying on the floor rolling their eyes. But no matter what we're talking about, it's much needed. whether we're doing a book recap or sharing the chisme of the family or talking about the pair of jeans that we wish would fit because they're getting too big. And so just those opportunities to be able to share with somebody and to kind of let your mind relax, right? I don't feel like I have to put up walls or hide things when I talk to you. It just all comes out, and that's really therapeutic. And I'm good until our next 3.5, 4-hour check-in the next week, but making sure that we have those social connections and that we get outside of ourselves, outside of our homes and outside of our safe places, because having that connection with other people can really empower us and energize us in ways that sometimes it's hard to admit or it's hard to see until after the fact, when we can walk away from that good friend or from that recovery counselor or from that individual at the drop-in center and say, wow, I feel so much better than when I came in and I didn't want to come in today. And making that a regular routine and something that we start to feed off of, and say, I need that connection. I want that connection because I know it's a healthy way for me to manage.
Absolutely. I think it's us understanding that, silence can be good. Silence is good when a really close friend of you asks you to keep a secret. Silence is good when you're planning a surprise party for your significant other.
Which everybody hates, by the way.
Yes. FYI, do not ever plan a surprise party for me.
Well, there goes that.
Yeah. But silence can actually be deadly, on the other end of it. And so I too value, that those opportunities to be able to talk to somebody and kind of let it out, because I think sometimes we don't realize how much we hold. It's not until for instance, I talk to you or I talk to my nana about what's going on, at the senior center with all my tias and, the chisme around who's going to make the tamales this year for Christmas. It goes on and on. But I don't realize till after I get off the phone with her how I'm no longer tense in my shoulders. I'm no longer shaking my foot uncontrollably. It feels so good to reach out to somebody and to just talk and to be able to know that we're not alone, and that while I would do very good on a deserted island, probably not the best thing for me.
So, inquiring minds are dying to know, what color is Nana's hair this season?
I think it's still purple because she has to wash out, but I think next she's doing blue. And I tell you, I cannot wait to be a 72-year-old viejita who gets to tell people to shut up and to get I love when she calls me and she says, oye, my friend is 85 and she's so old. And I tell her she's too old to be doing things, but she's not too old to get out and have lunch. And, I can't wait to yell that there's no salt in the rice. And
free. Opposite of the culture of silence is the viejita voice. Tell everybody what they don't want to hear.
To tell everybody what they don't want to hear, but they need to hear,
Right.
And to give my grandkids guilt trips about not calling every single day.
Right. Well, do you have any last words of wisdom, success stories, something that listeners can take away and say, that's something that I can implement in my life that comes from your lived experience, your work experience, or the people you've come in contact with?
Yeah, I would say that, day after day, when I see people walking through the door seeking, peer support, the fact that on their own volition, they are willing to reach out, that in itself is breaking the circle of silence. By reaching out, there's nothing more beautiful than to have somebody find out about peer support and break into tears and say, I didn't know that there were other people out there like me. Had I known this years ago, maybe things would have been different. Maybe not, but I'm so happy to have found it. When people finally realize their own power and they realize what they are capable of, and they go out and they very courageously tell their story, they share it so that somebody else will know that they are not alone, that to me is such a giant success. And I've seen so many people do that. I have been happy to know that I have been a part of people's journey, and I feel such a wealth of gratitude for those individuals who have trusted me enough to not be silent with me. And I can't wait for the rest of the world to see what we already know about peers.
Very cool. Well, thank you for the work that you do in the community and the work that you do yourself in raising strong, resilient boys and continuing your journey, whatever it may look like at certain times in your life. And I look forward to opportunities that we can continue to collaborate. So, te quiero y gracias por todo.
Gracias, mi hermana. Honestly, I want to say thank you to you. Thank you for being such a beautiful example of what we can do. Thank you for letting the world know that we are not the exception, that we are the rule, and that there's more to come from us.
Moving mountains, right?
Yep, moving mountains.
Just in full disclosure, Maxine and I have known each other and we have been great friends, and we have had the amazing opportunity to work together in peer support in Albuquerque, New Mexico specifically, but also just in being able to support each other as peers in recovery and using our lived experience to be there to help others. To get more information on the Albuquerque Center for Hope and Recovery and the work that they do in their community, visit www.achrnm.org or reach out to Maxine directly at 505-246-2247. I'm so thankful to the individuals who have come forward and been interviewed for the Star Center podcast. It's so important for individuals to be heard and to hear each other in regards to peer support and mental health. If you or someone you know needs assistance, please reach out to the following numbers. The SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP, the NAMI National Helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI, or at info@nami.org, and of course the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Please again feel free to reach out to us with further information, but also utilize these national helplines for any issues that you may be experiencing, any questions that you may have, or just for an opportunity to talk with someone close. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.